The wind hit the door like a fist that night, and Opal Quinn did not scream when she saw him standing in her kitchen holding a wrench. She had learned, in the 2 years since her husband died and left her with 3 children and a crumbling homestead on the edge of Laramie County, Wyoming, that screaming was a luxury she could not afford. She had learned to meet catastrophe with her jaw set, and her hands already moving toward whatever tool might fix the next disaster. So when she came downstairs at midnight in December of 1882, her candle throwing wild shadows across the kitchen walls, and found a stranger crouched beside her broken cast-iron stove with grease on his fingers and what appeared to be a bullet hole in the shoulder of his coat, she did not scream. She said, "Get away from that stove." He looked up at her. His eyes were dark and careful, the eyes of a man who had spent years calculating the distance between himself and the nearest exit. He was not old, perhaps 30 or 31, with the lean, weathered face of someone who lived outdoors in every season, and a jaw that had not seen a razor in at least a week. There was dried blood on his collar. There was snow melting in his dark hair. He said, "Ma'am, I'm fixing it." "I can see what you are doing," Opal said. Her voice did not shake. She was proud of that. "What I am asking is why you broke into my home in the middle of the night to do it." "I didn't break in," he said. "Your back door doesn't latch properly. A child could push it open. I noticed it when I came through your yard looking for somewhere to shelter from the storm." He paused, and then something shifted in his expression, something she would later identify as the first honest thing she had ever seen from him. "I heard the children coughing." The words landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She had heard them too. She had been lying awake listening to it, that thin, dry cough coming through the wall from the room where her daughters slept, Rosalie, who was 7, and Bess, who was 5, and her son Walter, who was 9, and already tried so hard to be the man of the house that it broke her heart daily. She had been lying awake, knowing the stove had gone cold, knowing the pipe fitting had cracked 2 days ago, and she had no money to buy a replacement and no man to help her install one even if she had, and knowing that the temperature outside was dropping toward something lethal. She had been lying awake making the calculation that desperate mothers make in the dark, the one where every option leads somewhere terrible and you just have to choose the least terrible thing. And then a stranger had appeared in her kitchen and started fixing the problem, and now she was standing there in her nightgown with a candle in her hand trying to decide whether that was Providence or danger wearing Providence's coat. "Who are you?" she asked. He was already turning back to the stove. "Nobody important." "Hand me that rag if you would, please." "I am not handing you anything until you tell me your name." He glanced at her over his shoulder. There was something almost amused in it, though it was tired amusement, the kind that comes from a man who has lived past the point where much surprises him. "Phineas," he said. "Phineas Hayes." The name meant nothing to her in that moment. She did not yet know that Phineas Hayes was wanted in 3 territories for charges ranging from robbery to association with the Decker gang, that there was a reward of $200 on his head posted in the sheriff's office in Cheyenne, that the bullet in his shoulder had been put there by a deputy who had nearly caught him crossing the Laramie River 2 days prior. She did not know any of that. All she knew was that he had his hands on her stove and her children were coughing in the cold. She handed him the rag. He worked in near silence for the better part of an hour. Opal sat at the kitchen table, the candle between them, watching him with the wary attention of a woman who had made too many mistakes by trusting too quickly. He had removed the cracked fitting and was fashioning a replacement from a length of metal pipe he had apparently pulled from somewhere in the lining of his coat, the kind of thing a man carries when he is always improvising survival, always one step ahead of the next disaster. "You have done this before," she said. "Fixed stoves." He didn't look up. "Some." "You know what I mean." A pause. The wind pushed at the walls of the house. "I grew up on a farm in Missouri," he said finally, "before things went the way they went." She did not ask what that meant. Not yet. When the fitting was secured and he had carefully rerouted the pipe and checked every joint 3 times with the methodical patience of a man who understood that cold was not something to negotiate with, he built a fire in the stove's belly using the wood she had stacked beside it. The flames caught, orange and honest, and the heat began to spread outward from the iron sides of the stove like something being remembered. He stood and looked at it for a moment. Then he said quietly, not quite to her and not quite to himself, "Your children should not wake to a frozen house." Opal Quinn felt the back of her throat tighten in a way she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. She said, "No, they should not." He turned to look at her, and for a moment the kitchen was just the two of them and the fire and the sound of the wind retreating slightly, as though it had been waiting to see what happened. Then he reached for his coat. "You are leaving," she said. "I should be gone before morning. You are hurt. I've been hurt before." She stood up from the table. She was not a small woman, Opal Quinn. She was sturdy and straight-backed from years of work that required both those things. And when she stood up in that kitchen with the firelight on her face, she looked like someone who had made decisions that cost her everything and was still standing to make more. "Sit down," she said. "I will look at your shoulder." "Ma'am, you just spent an hour fixing my stove in the middle of the night so my children would not freeze. The least I can do is clean whatever hole is in your shoulder. Sit down, Mr. Hayes." He sat down. That was how it began. The morning that followed was strange and careful. The way mornings are when the world has shifted slightly on its axis in the night, and everyone is pretending it hasn't. Opal had cleaned the wound in his shoulder, which was not as bad as the blood suggested, though it was bad enough, and bandaged it with strips torn from an old sheet. And she had done all of this with the competent, impersonal efficiency of a woman who had nursed a sick husband through 2 winters and 3 broken bones. Phineas Hayes had sat very still and said almost nothing, which she appreciated, because men who talked too much during painful things were men who wanted to be reassured, and she did not have the energy for that. She had let him sleep in the barn. She had brought him a blanket and a tin plate with biscuits and cold beans left from supper and a cup of water, and she had said, "You can stay until the storm passes," which was not generosity so much as practicality, because a man who was injured and cold and hungry was a man who might do desperate things, and she had 3 children inside those walls. But that was the lie she told herself, and she knew it even as she told it. The truth was something softer and more frightening. The truth was that when he had said your children should not wake to a frozen house, he had said it as though it were a simple fact, as though it were as obvious as breathing, and she had not heard anyone speak to her that way since her husband died. Like her children's comfort was just something that mattered. Like she was not alone in the mathematics of keeping them alive. The storm lasted 3 days. She would look back on those 3 days later as the last ordinary time, the last period when she was still Opal Quinn, the widow with the homestead and nothing else, before everything complicated itself in the way that only real life can complicate things. Her children met him on the second morning. She had not planned for it. Walter had gotten up early, as he always did, and gone to the barn to feed the animals, and found Phineas Hayes asleep in the hay with his coat pulled over him. And instead of being frightened, Walter had apparently stood over him for several minutes trying to figure out whether he was alive. And when Phineas had opened his eyes to find a 9-year-old boy staring at him from approximately 12 inches away, he had said, "Morning," in the exact same tone he would have used if it were perfectly normal to wake up in a stranger's barn. Walter had told her about it later, standing very straight the way he stood when he was trying to seem older than he was. "He's not dangerous," Walter had announced, with the absolute certainty of a 9-year-old who has made up his mind. "I can tell." "Can you?" Opal had said. "He looked me in the eye," Walter said. "Daddy always said that a man who looks you in the eye is a man who has nothing to hide." Opal had thought carefully that her husband had also said many things that turned out not to be entirely true, but she had not said that to Walter. Rosalie and Bess were warier, especially Bess, who had been only 3 when their father died, and had developed in the intervening years a fierce attachment to her mother, and a deep suspicion of anything that seemed like it might pull her mother's attention elsewhere. But on the second afternoon, when the snow was still coming down hard, and the world outside the frost-rimmed windows was nothing but white noise, Phineas had come to the back door and asked if he could help with anything, and Opal had been in the middle of trying to chop a frozen joint of venison with a knife that badly needed sharpening, and she had handed him the task without thinking about what that meant. He had sharpened the knife first, on a whetstone he pulled from his pocket methodically and without being asked, and then he had broken down the venison, and then, because Rosalie was watching from the doorway with huge eyes and eventually curiosity wins over caution in 7-year-olds, he had shown her how to tell which way the grain of the meat ran so you cut it right. Rosalie had said, "My papa used to do the cooking sometimes." Phineas had said, "Did he? Was he a good cook?" "He burned things," Rosalie had said seriously. "I burned things too," Phineas said. "It's an honest mistake." Rosalie had laughed. It was the first time Opal had heard Rosalie really laugh in months, and something in Opal's carefully constructed fortress shifted 1 inch out of alignment. On the third day, the storm broke. The world outside was white and glittering and brutally cold, the kind of cold that turns your breath to fog the moment you open your mouth, but the sky was clear and hard blue, and Phineas Hayes stood at the back door of the house with his coat on, and his pack slung over his sound shoulder, and the morning light making him look for a moment like something drawn in charcoal against all that white. "I'll be getting on," he said. "I know," Opal said. She had prepared herself for this. She was very good at preparing herself for things. She had packed him some food in a cloth, biscuits and the rest of the venison stew and a chunk of hardtack that would last a long time, and she handed it to him now and watched him look at it for a moment as though he was surprised. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "You fixed my stove," she said. "We're square." He tucked the bundle into his pack. He looked at her. She noticed again those careful dark eyes, the way they took things in without immediately giving anything back. "The back door latch," he said. "There's a broken pin in the hasp. If you have a spare nail the right size, you can fashion a replacement." I left instructions on the back of an envelope on the table. She had not seen the envelope. She thought about him sitting down sometime in those 3 days and writing out instructions for her, and that tightening happened again in the back of her throat. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He started to turn away. "Mr. Hayes," she said. He stopped. She should have let him go. Every practical thought in her head said to let him go, that a man passing through in the night with a bullet in his shoulder and no answers about where he came from or where he was headed was not a man to encourage. She had children to think about. She had a homestead that barely kept them alive. She had a reputation in the small community of Clearwater Junction that was already fragile enough, widow woman alone out here, barely managing, always one bad season away from losing the land. She said, "If you ever need shelter again, you know where this place is." He looked at her for a long moment. The cold made everything very still between them. "I know where it is," he said. And then he walked away into the white morning, and she stood in the doorway watching until he was gone, and then she went inside and found the envelope on the table and read his instructions for fixing the door latch, which were clear and detailed and written in a surprisingly careful hand, and she sat down at the kitchen table and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of feeling something she had no name for yet. Then she got up and made breakfast for her children. 6 weeks passed. She fixed the door latch using a nail she found in the bottom of the toolbox her husband had left, following Phineas Hayes's instructions exactly. She kept the stove burning. She got Walter through a bout of bronchitis by keeping the room warm and making onion broth and sitting up with him through the worst nights. She sold 2 quilts she had spent the fall making to a merchant in town and used the money for flour and salt and lamp oil. She thought about Phineas Hayes perhaps more than was sensible, but she thought about him the way you think about a thing that has passed, like a hawk crossing your field of vision, present and then gone. She thought about his hands on the stove fittings, steady and certain. She thought about the way he had said your children should not wake to a frozen house, not as a criticism, not as pity, just as a fact he was addressing. She thought about the back of his coat walking away into the snow. She did not expect to see him again. He came back on a Tuesday in late January, 1883. She heard the horse first, the creak of hooves on packed snow, and she went to the window and looked out and saw him riding up the track toward the house on a bay horse that had seen better days but was still moving with reasonable energy. He was riding straight, which meant his shoulder had healed well enough. He stopped in the yard and sat for a moment, and she had the sense that he was deciding something. She went to the door before he could knock. He looked slightly surprised to see her standing there already. "Mrs. Quinn," he said. "Mr. Hayes," she said. "You look like you haven't eaten in 2 days." "Yesterday," he said, which was not really a disagreement. She stepped back from the door. He came inside. She fed him because that was what you did, and while she heated up leftover soup and put bread on the table, she asked him no questions, because she had decided sometime in the last 6 weeks that if he was going to tell her anything, he would tell her when he chose to, and pushing would only make him close up like a clam. She had learned that from her husband, who had been a man full of secrets about his family back in Virginia, secrets she had only begun to uncover after he died, and she had decided the lesson was that you couldn't pry open a person, you could only make enough space that they might choose to open. Walter found him at the table and said, "You came back," with the satisfied tone of someone whose judgment has been confirmed. Phineas said, "I came back." "Are you staying?" Walter asked. There was a pause. Opal kept her back to the table, stirring the soup. "I don't know yet," Phineas said honestly. "You could stay," Walter said. "We have the barn." "Walter," Opal said quietly, not turning around. "He can have the barn," Walter said, unperturbed. "It's warm enough in there now that you got the stove going. He fixed the stove." "I know who fixed the stove," Opal said. "Eat your lunch." But that evening, when the children were in bed and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Opal and Phineas sat at the kitchen table with mugs of coffee between them, and she said, "You are in trouble." It was not a question. He wrapped his hands around his mug and looked at the steam rising from it. "Some. The bullet in your shoulder. Among other things." She waited. He was quiet for a long time. The fire in the stove popped and settled. Outside, a coyote called somewhere far away and then fell silent. "I rode with a man named Decker," he said at last. "Emmett Decker. You may have heard the name." She had. Everyone in Wyoming territory had heard of Emmett Decker, a man who had built a reputation for robbing freight wagons and occasionally worse things, a man whose gang had shot a railroad agent in Rawlins 2 years ago and left him to die in the road. A man whose crimes had made the territorial papers with regularity. "I've heard it," she said carefully. "I rode with him for 4 years, Phineas said. "Starting in '79 when I had no options I could see and no sense about which options were real." He paused. "That is not an excuse. It is a fact. I was 26 years old and I had just watched my farm in Missouri get taken by a bank, and I had watched my mother die of something that a doctor could have treated if we had money for a doctor, and I was about as far into despair as a person can get before they start making choices they would not otherwise make." Opal was very still. "I am not proud of what I did in those years," he said. "I am telling you because you asked, and because I think you deserve to know what kind of man has been sleeping in your barn." He looked at her directly. Those careful eyes, nothing hidden in them now, or maybe just the one thing that couldn't be helped. "I am not with Decker anymore. I haven't been for 8 months. I left after a job in Colorado that went a direction I could not be part of. A man was hurt who should not have been hurt, a man who was just doing his job." "The railroad agent," she said. "No, that was before my time with them. Different men, different crime." He shook his head. "A stage driver in Colorado last year. He fought back and Decker shot him. He lived, but only just." His jaw was set. "I rode away that night and I haven't gone back. I've been moving ever since, trying to stay ahead of the warrant and figure out what happens next for a man like me." Opal looked at him steadily. She thought about the woman she had been before her husband died, the woman who had had a clearer map of the world, who had known more certainly which choices were right and which were wrong. She thought about the woman she had become since, the woman who had learned that the world was not simple and that people were not simple, and that the most important question was usually not what did you do, but what are you doing now? Why did you come back? She asked. He was quiet again. Then he said, because this is the first place in 8 months that felt like something I was moving toward instead of something I was running from. She looked at him for a long time. You can have the barn, she said. Through the winter, you work for your keep. I have fence line that needs repair and the roof of the chicken coop is failing and there are 100 things around this place that need doing that I cannot do alone. You do not bring your trouble to my door. If lawmen come asking, I don't know you. Those are my terms. He looked at her. Something moved through his expression that was not quite surprise, but was perhaps the thing that comes just after surprise when you've processed an unexpected kindness. Those are fair terms, he said. Yes, she said. They are. Get some sleep, Mr. Hayes. I need that chicken coop roof done before the next freeze. He almost smiled. She saw it at the corner of his mouth before he shut it down. She went upstairs and lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about what she had just done. She thought about the warrant on his head. She thought about the Decker gang, which was still operating and still dangerous. She thought about her children sleeping down the hall. And then she thought about the way he had said your children should not wake to a frozen house, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Like the most important thing in any situation was keeping the most vulnerable people warm. She decided she could live with the risk. He was a remarkable worker. That surprised her, though it should not have, because a man who could fashion a replacement pipe fitting from materials he had in his coat pockets and install it in the middle of the night by candlelight was clearly a man who knew how to do things. He repaired the chicken coop roof in a day and a half, working in temperatures that made her own fingers ache to look at. He rebuilt the section of fence on the north pasture that had been leaning since October. He found the source of the slow leak in the well cover and fixed it in an afternoon. He worked alone and quietly, and he did not ask for praise, which was good because she was not in the habit of giving it. She fed him and gave him the barn and occasionally handed him coffee through the back door in the mornings, and they spoke mostly about practical things, about what needed doing and how and what materials were needed. But the evenings were a different kind of currency. After supper, when the children had done their lessons and the fire was low and the night had settled in, Phineas would sometimes sit with them in the main room. He would not push his way into these moments. He would appear in the doorway and wait to be invited, and Opal would nod, and he would come in and sit in the chair by the window, and the children would gradually stop treating him as a guest. Walter asked him about horses, and Phineas knew a great deal about horses, and they had long technical conversations that Opal only half listened to while she mended things by the fire. Rosalie, who had discovered he could whittle, demanded increasingly complex subjects, a rabbit, then a horse, then a whole barnyard of animals that she arranged on the windowsill of her bedroom. Bess, who warmed the slowest, eventually came to sit beside him when he was working on something, not saying much, just present, which was Bess's version of complete trust. Opal watched all of this from a careful distance. She was not allowing herself to feel it, not fully, not yet. She knew the shape of danger when she saw it, and the danger was not Phineas Hayes himself, not anymore. She had watched him long enough to believe what he told her about himself. The danger was what was happening in her own chest in the evenings when he looked up from whatever he was doing and their eyes met across the room. She was 32 years old. She had been a widow for 2 years. She had spent those 2 years so focused on survival that she had nearly forgotten she was a woman as well as a mother, as well as a farmer, as well as all the other things she had to be. She had nearly forgotten that she was a person capable of wanting something for herself. Phineas Hayes was reminding her. It happened slowly, in increments, the way the light changes in spring, so gradually you can't name the moment it became warm. It happened in the small things. The morning he came into the kitchen and saw her struggling with the heavy barrel of flour and simply took one side of it without being asked and without making anything of it. The afternoon he came upon her sitting on the back step staring at nothing with her hands in her lap, clearly at the edge of her endurance, and he had not said anything comforting and hollow. He had just sat down on the step beside her and been quiet with her until she was ready to go back inside. The evening Walter cut his hand on a piece of fence wire and was trying very hard not to cry, and Phineas had cleaned and wrapped the cut with such calm, practiced gentleness that Walter had not cried, and then Phineas had said, "That is a good clean cut. It will heal clean," in the tone of someone giving a good report, and Walter had stood up 6 inches taller. She was falling in love with him. She recognized it the way you recognize the smell of rain coming before you can see the clouds. She recognized it and she was afraid of it and she did not know what to do with it, because her circumstances were what they were and his circumstances were what they were, and the gap between those two sets of circumstances seemed, in her clearer moments, unbridgeable. He had a warrant on his head. There was a reward posted in Cheyenne. Men came through this part of Wyoming with some frequency looking for people the law wanted. Bounty hunters and deputy marshals and men who were just opportunistic enough to collect a $200 reward if they happened across the right face. If any of those men stopped at her homestead and saw Phineas Hayes in her yard, everything she had built would come apart. She knew all of this. She was falling anyway. The moment of crisis came in early March. It was a Thursday, a clear, cold Thursday, and she had driven the wagon into Clearwater Junction for supplies. She had left Phineas with the children, which was a thing that had simply become natural over the past several weeks, the way that certain things settle into your life and stop requiring deliberate decisions. He watched the children. She ran errands. They did not discuss what this arrangement meant. They were both very good at not discussing things. In town, at the general store, she ran into Hattie Pierce, who was the closest thing she had to a friend in Clearwater Junction, a brisk, warm woman who ran the laundry and knew everything about everyone within 20 miles. Hattie pulled her aside near the bolts of calico. "Opal," Hattie said, in the tone that meant news was coming. "There's a deputy marshal been asking around. Name of Crandall. He came in yesterday and stayed at the boarding house. He's been in the saloon showing a picture to people." Opal felt her stomach drop. She kept her face very still. "Is that so?" "A man named Hayes," Hattie said, watching her with those sharp, kind eyes. "Phineas Hayes. He's got a warrant from 3 territories." A pause. "Opal, is there anything you want to tell me?" "No," Opal said. Hattie looked at her for a long moment. "The deputy asked about homesteaders in the area. I told him there was nobody out your way but you and your children. He seemed to believe me." Another pause. "He's planning on riding out tomorrow to check the properties on the east side of the creek." Opal held her friend's gaze. "Why are you telling me this, Hattie?" Hattie tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear and looked at the bolts of calico. "Because I have been watching you since Thomas died," she said quietly, "and I have not once seen you look the way you've been looking lately, like something in you is alive again." She glanced back at Opal. "Whatever that man did in his past, I trust you to know what he is now, and I thought you might want to know about the deputy." Opal drove home faster than was wise, given the state of the track, and when she pulled into the yard, Phineas was in the side yard splitting wood, and Walter was stacking it, and they were talking about something, and the scene looked so ordinary and so right that she felt the danger of it physically, like a cold hand on the back of her neck. She got down from the wagon and said, "Walter, go inside and help your sisters, please." Walter looked at her face and went. Phineas set down the axe. He was already reading her expression. "What happened?" he said, not a question. She told him all of it quickly and plainly. She watched the information move through him, the way a man processes a trap closing, the calculation that happens in the eyes. "Crandall," he said when she finished. "He's a determined man. He will not be put off by not finding me on the east properties. He'll circle back." "I know," she said. "I should leave," he said. The words fell between them like something irretrievable. She said, "I know." Neither of them moved. The afternoon light was the thin, slanting kind that February was starting to offer toward March, promising eventually without delivering, and it was in Phineas Hayes's face, and she could see in it everything she had been refusing to look at directly for the past 6 weeks. The way he had settled into her world, into the spaces her world had left empty. The way her children looked at him. The way she herself had begun to think of the evenings differently, as something to arrive at rather than just another part of the long day. "Opal," he said. Her name in his voice was a thing she had not been ready for, the quiet weight of it. "Don't," she said. Not because she didn't want to hear it, because she was afraid that if she heard it she would ask him to stay, and if she asked him to stay she would be putting all of them in danger. "I have to say it," he said, "because I am going to leave tomorrow and I don't know what happens after that, and there are things that deserve to be said when there's still time to say them." He was very still. "I have not felt like myself, like the man I was before everything went wrong, since I was 25 years old. These last weeks have been the first time I remembered what that felt like. It's because of you. Because of the way you run this place and the way you talk to your children and the way you handed me that rag in the middle of the night like you were already deciding to trust me before you were sure you should." He paused. "I know I don't have anything to offer. I know what I am, but I needed you to know that." Opal looked at him for a long, slow moment. "Where would you go?" she asked. "West, probably. California. There are places in California where a warrant from Wyoming territory doesn't reach." He looked at the horizon. "I've heard there's work in Sacramento for men who know machinery, farms with new irrigation systems that need maintaining." "That sounds lonely," she said. He looked at her, she looked back. "Phineas," she said, "is there any way to make this right, the warrants? Is there any path that leads somewhere that isn't running forever?" He had thought about this. She could see he had thought about it, probably many times, in the way you see a man who has been turning a question over so long it has worn smooth. "There's a judge in Cheyenne," he said slowly. "Judge Harlan. He has a reputation for looking at men's full records, not just the worst parts. I've heard of men turning themselves into him, men who could show they had left their former lives behind and getting reduced sentences, working out a deal." He shook his head. "It's a risk. If it went wrong, I'd be looking at serious time. 5 years minimum, maybe more. But if it went right," she said. "If it went right," he said and stopped. "If it went right," she said carefully, "you would be a free man, you could work, you could settle somewhere." The word settle hung in the cold air between them. He looked at her with those careful dark eyes. "Are you suggesting something, Opal?" "I am suggesting," she said, "that running for the rest of your life is not a life. And I am suggesting that there are people in this world who would find it worth their while to wait for a man who was doing the hard, honest thing." She held his gaze. "That is what I am suggesting." He reached out and took her hand. It was the first time he had ever touched her that wasn't functional, wasn't helping or working or fixing something. Her hand was rough from work and his hand was rough from the same, and they stood in the thin winter light in the yard of her homestead, and she felt the whole complicated weight of what she was. "5 years is a long time," he said quietly. "I have been waiting 2 years for something to come back to life," she said. "I can wait 5 more." He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, briefly, something that was not quite a kiss and not quite something else, just a mark of sincerity. "I'm going to go to Cheyenne," he said. "I'll turn myself in to Judge Harlan. I'll tell him everything I told you. I'll write you a letter," she said, "about your character, about these weeks, whatever a judge needs to hear." "Opal," he looked at her, "you understand what you'd be attaching your name to." "I understand what I'd be attaching my name to," she said steadily. "I know the difference between what a man was and what he is. I think a judge worth his salt does too." He left the next morning before dawn, which was necessary because Deputy Marshal Crandall was expected in the area, and Opal could not have them intersect. She said goodbye to him in the barn in the gray pre-dawn, the horses breathing soft fog in the cold, the children still asleep in the house. It was not a dramatic goodbye. It was the kind of goodbye that acknowledges everything without being able to say all of it because there is not enough time or quite enough words yet. He said, "I will write when there is something to say." She said, "I will be here." When Crandall came by that afternoon, she told him she'd seen no stranger in weeks, and she told it so calmly and so directly that he had no reason to doubt her. He was a weathered, professional man who was doing a job, and he did his job thoroughly enough, looking around the barn and the outbuildings, but Phineas had been thorough too. There was no trace of him except, if you knew where to look, the repaired chicken coop roof and the rebuilt fence line and the small, careful army of whittled animals on Rosalie's windowsill. Deputy Marshal Crandall rode away before supper. Opal wrote her letter to Judge Harlan that same evening, sitting at the kitchen table by lamplight, choosing her words with the same care she would have used to choose what to plant in which field, thinking about what would take root and what would not. She described a man who had repaired her stove in the middle of a blizzard. She described the precision of his work, the care he had taken to ensure her children's safety. She described the weeks of honest labor on her property. She described the man who had sat quietly on the step beside her when she was at the edge of her limits, and the man who had taught Rosalie about the grain of meat and told Walter that his cut would heal clean. She described, without overstating it, what she believed about the distance between who Phineas Hayes had been and who he was now. She folded the letter and addressed it and sent it with the post rider the following Tuesday. Then she waited. Spring came to Laramie County the way it always did, in fits and starts, with warm days that made you believe and cold snaps that reminded you not to. She planted her kitchen garden and negotiated the breeding of her 2 heifers and argued with the creek about whether it was going to flood her lower pasture, which it did in April, just barely, taking 3 fence posts with it, and leaving her standing in the mud surveying the damage with her hands on her hips in the posture of a woman who has been through worse. The first letter from Phineas came in late March, about 3 weeks after he had left. He had arrived in Cheyenne. He had presented himself to Judge Harlan's clerk and been taken into custody. He was being held in the county jail while the judge reviewed his case. His letter was short and factual, written in that careful hand, but at the end he wrote, "I think of the barn in the mornings when the light comes through the slats. I think of biscuits. I think about the things I said in the yard and whether I had any right to say them, and I still believe I did." She wrote back immediately. She told him about the flooding creek and the 3 fence posts. She told him Walter had found a stray dog and named it Sheriff, which Phineas would find funny if he knew Walter. She told him Bess had stopped waking in the night with bad dreams, which had been happening since the winter, and that she thought it was because the house felt less frightening now, though she did not specify why. She told him she was glad he was in Cheyenne and not California. She did not say "I love you," because they had not arrived at that word yet, but she was aware of its weight in the empty space of the letter. Letters went back and forth through April and into May. She learned things about him in the letters that she had not learned in the barn and the kitchen, because the letters gave him more time to choose his words, and she was discovering, a man who could be quite articulate when he was not watching himself so carefully. He told her about Missouri, about his father who had worked the farm with a dour, stubborn competence that Phineas had inherited without the dourness. About his mother, whose name was Louisa, who had known the names of every plant that grew wild on their land. About the bank that took everything in the winter of 1878, the brutal, efficient cruelty of it, the way a man's life's work could be reduced to a signature on a document and a locksmith at the door. He told her about Emmett Decker, more than he'd said in the kitchen. Not excusing it, but explaining it, the way that despair and anger and a certain kind of pride can combine in a young man who has lost everything, and make him capable of following a man he knows is wrong because at least that man seems certain, at least that man seems to know where he is going. He told her about the 4 years and what they had done to him, the slow erosion of something he could only describe as the version of himself he had wanted to be. He told her about the night he left the Decker gang. The stage driver had been a man named Oscar Purcell, about 50 years old, and after Decker shot him, Phineas had been the one to get him off the road and stop the bleeding enough that the man had a chance, while Decker and the others rode on. He had sat by the road in the dark holding a stranger's life together with his hands, and something had clarified in him, the way things clarify sometimes only when you're in the worst part of them. He had left that night. She wrote back, "A man who stays when he doesn't have to, who holds the pieces together when everyone else has left, that is the man I know. That is the man I am waiting for." The hearing before Judge Harlan was in June. She could not be there, obviously. She could not leave the homestead and the children for a trip to Cheyenne. But she knew the date, and she spent that day going about her work with a particular quality of attention, very focused on each task in front of her, very deliberate about not thinking too far ahead. Walter asked her at dinner why she was being so quiet, and she said she had a lot on her mind, which Walter accepted because he was 9.5 now, and understood that adults had complicated inner lives even if the details were murky. The letter came 11 days later. She saw it in the pile of posts the writer brought and recognized Phineas's handwriting and stood in the yard for a moment with it in her hand, feeling the weight of it, which was several pages. She went inside. She sat down. She opened it. Judge Harlan had considered the full record. He had read Opal's letter, which Phineas quoted from at length, and he had taken into account the testimony about the night of the Oscar Purcell shooting, including a statement from Purcell himself, who had apparently come forward voluntarily to say that a member of the gang had stayed to help him rather than fleeing with the others. Judge Harlan had also taken into account the 8 months of Phineas Hayes's life after leaving Decker, the fact that he had turned himself in voluntarily rather than continuing to run, and the character testimony that several people had provided. The sentence was 2 years, not 5, 2 years. With the 8 months since leaving the gang counting toward time, which was a concession the judge had made quietly and which Phineas said he had not expected, which meant 14 months remaining, which meant that if nothing went wrong, Phineas Hayes would be a free man by August of 1884. He had written, "I read your letter in the courtroom." The judge read it aloud. "I could not look at the room when he was reading it because I did not want anyone to see my face. I am writing this from a cell in the Cheyenne County Jail, and the light is coming through a very small window, and it is the best light I have ever seen because it is the light of a thing being possible that I did not think was possible. 14 months. I will be there in 14 months, if you will still have me." Opal Quinn read that letter 3 times. Then she put it in the tin box where she kept the things that mattered, alongside Thomas's watch and her parents' wedding photograph and the children's birth records. She took out a fresh piece of paper. She wrote, "I will still have you. Come home. 14 months." She had kept a homestead alive through 2 brutal Wyoming winters with 3 small children and no help and no margin for error. She could manage 14 months. She did more than manage. She thrived, in the way that happens sometimes when a person has something specific to move toward. She worked the land that summer with a precision and an energy that surprised even her, putting in a larger kitchen garden than she had dared before and getting a surprisingly good yield from it. She traded the surplus vegetables to Hattie in town for preserved goods. She arranged for Walter to work 2 afternoons a week at the smithy, not because they needed the money urgently, but because Walter needed to be doing something with his hands that made him feel useful, and the smith was a decent man who worked him appropriately. Rosalie was learning to read with a speed that made Opal proud and slightly dizzy. Bess, who was now 6, had taken a passionate interest in the chickens and appointed herself their primary caretaker, naming them all and knowing their individual personalities with the precision of someone who takes her responsibilities very seriously. Letters continued through the summer and fall and into the second winter. They had settled into a rhythm that was almost domestic in its comfort, the exchange of information about practical things, his observations about life in the county jail, which was run by a reasonably decent warden, her news about the homestead. But underneath the practical things there was always the other current, warmer and more urgent, and it expressed itself sometimes in a sentence slipped between accounts of chickens and fence repairs. Something like, "I think about the evenings by the fire more than anything else," or "I have memorized the way you looked standing in the doorway in the morning light." She wrote back things like, "Rosalie asked me this morning if you were coming back, and I told her yes, and she looked satisfied in a way that made me want to cry in the good way." She wrote, "I have been thinking about what comes next, practically speaking. There is a great deal of work here for a man who knows how to do things. There is land that could be improved. I have been looking into whether the homestead claim could be expanded northward. I think it could. I have been thinking about what we could make of this place with 2 people running it instead of 1. He wrote back, "I have been thinking the same things. Also some other things that are less practical and more about wanting to sit across a table from you again and see your face. Christmas of 1883 was better than it had been in years." She found a way to stretch her budget to include oranges, which she had not been able to afford the previous year, and Walter got a book on horses from Hattie, and Rosalie got 3 new hair ribbons, and Bess got a pair of proper boots that actually fit, and in the evening Opal read to them by the fire and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that her life was not just endurance. It was something. She wrote to Phineas that night after the children were in bed, "Merry Christmas from this house. We are all well and the stove is burning perfectly, as you would expect from the work you did on it. I think this is the first Christmas in 2 years that I have felt clearly that next year will be better and not just hoped for it. That is because of you." He wrote back, "Merry Christmas. I am counting weeks. Spring again, 1884. She got word in April that his release had been confirmed for August 12th. The letter in which he told her was different from his usual careful letters. It was slightly uneven, as though his hand had not been entirely steady when he wrote it. He wrote, "August 12th. I want to arrive at your place before dark if I can manage the ride. I don't know what to expect exactly, and I know there are things we have not talked about fully, important things about what we both want. And I know I should probably not expect anything, but I find that I am expecting everything, which is not my usual way of doing things, and I want you to know that, so there is nothing hidden between us." She wrote back, "August 12th. I will have supper on the table. There is nothing hidden between us either. Come home, Phineas." She told the children in July, when it was close enough to be real rather than just a plan. She told them that Mr. Hayes was coming back, that he had been away dealing with some difficult matters, but that those matters were resolved now and that he was coming to stay. Walter said, "I knew he would come back." Rosalie said, "Can he make the rabbit again? He made me a rabbit, but I want a bigger one." Bess said solemnly, "He should have the room next to the kitchen." Opal said, "We'll see about that," but she said it softly. She did not sleep well on the night of August 11th. She lay in the dark listening to the sounds of the Wyoming summer, the crickets and the far-off coyotes and the horses moving in the pasture, and she thought about the years, the whole long story of the past 18 months, and she thought about the man who was riding toward her through the dark and everything that was riding with him. August 12th, 1884 was hot and clear, and so blue it almost hurt to look at the sky. She was in the kitchen garden when she heard the horse. She had been telling herself all morning not to watch the track. She had deliberately put herself in the garden rather than anywhere with a view of the approach road, because watching and waiting was something she had spent the last 14 months working not to let consume her. But the moment she heard the hooves, she straightened up and turned, and there he was, coming up the track on the same bay horse, a little better fed than the last time, riding straight with his hat pushed back and the sun full on his face. He saw her and reined in. She walked toward the gate. He dismounted before she got there, which meant he was walking toward her at the same time she was walking toward him, and they met at the gate in the garden fence, which was perhaps not the most romantic location, but which was exactly right, given that it was made of lumber he had helped her select and fence posts he had helped her set. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You're here," she said. "I told you I would be," he said. He was thinner than she remembered, and there were new lines around his eyes that had not been there in December of 1882, and his hair was shorter, as though someone had cut it recently, perhaps for the occasion. He was holding his hat in his hands and looking at her with an expression that had nothing careful in it anymore, nothing held back or calculated, just pure undisguised feeling. She had forgotten in the abstract distance of letters how immediate he was, how real. She stepped through the gate and he put his arms around her and she put her face against his shoulder, the right shoulder, the one that had been shot and had healed, and he held on with the kind of steadiness that she had recognized in him from the very beginning, the first night in the kitchen, the steadiness of a man who held things together when they needed holding. 14 months, she said, into his shoulder. Too long, he said into her hair. Yes, she said, too long. They stood like that for a long moment in the August heat, in the garden she had grown from necessity and the yard he had helped repair, in the life she had built from the wreckage of another life, and it felt remarkably like what it was, like something that had earned itself. "Mama," said Walter from the back door, with the particular tone of a boy who has been watching this reunion for at least 2 minutes and has opinions about the length of it. Opal laughed. It came out of her like something that had been waiting. "Come and meet us properly," she called back. The reunion with the children was the kind of thing that resisted being described too closely, because it was made of small private things. Walter shaking hands with Phineas very seriously, and then abandoning seriousness entirely, and asking 17 questions about horses in rapid succession. Rosalie presenting her whittled animals as evidence of his previous work, and demanding to know when he would begin on the larger rabbit. Bess, who was 7 now, standing a little apart, watching, and then quietly going to stand beside Phineas and putting her small hand into his large one, matter-of-factly, as though it were a thing she had simply decided. He looked down at her small hand, and then at Opal over Bess's head, and the expression on his face was one she would keep privately for the rest of her life. Supper that evening was fried chicken and biscuits and the first of the corn from the kitchen garden, and there was pie, which she had made that morning because pie felt like the appropriate acknowledgement of an occasion, and they sat around the table together, all 5 of them, the way they had not been able to do in the months when she had imagined it. The conversation was loud and overlapping and full of the children's voices, and Phineas ate with the focused attention of a man who has been eating institution food for 14 months and finds chicken and biscuits a religious experience, and Opal watched all of it and felt the fullness of it settle into her. After the children were in bed, she and Phineas sat on the back steps with the last of the day's warmth still in the boards and the stars coming out overhead in that dense Wyoming way, and they talked for a long time, really talked, the way letters never quite allow, the give and take of 2 voices in real time, filling in the gaps that the written word leaves. He told her about the jail, honestly, not prettily, but also about what he had done with the time, the reading, the work, the thinking. He told her about a man he had befriended there, a former surveyor named Clement who had gotten into trouble over a land dispute, and how Clement had taught him more about land law than he had ever expected to know, which was going to be useful. She told him about the homestead expansion she had been researching, the northern parcel that abutted her land and had not been claimed, and the process for filing. She told him about Walter's growing expertise with the blacksmith's tools and Rosalie's reading and Bess and the chickens. She told him about Hattie, who knew about him and was on their side. She told him about the winter of '83 and the freeze that had come in January and how the stove had held, his work still holding. He said, "Tell me what you need fixed next," she said. "The north fence line needs a proper overhaul, and there's a section of the barn roof that worries me." He said, "I can start tomorrow," she said. "You just arrived." He said, "I've been not doing useful things for 14 months. Let me start tomorrow." She looked at him in the starlight. She said, "Phineas, there are things we should talk about before you start on the fence line, things about what this is." "I know," he said. "I have 3 children," she said, "who have already lost one person they were attached to. I'm not interested in situations that are temporary or unclear." "I know," he said again. "I am saying," she said carefully, "that if you are here, I need you to be here, fully and clearly and with intention." He turned to look at her directly. "I have thought about nothing else for 14 months," he said. "I know exactly what I am here for. I am here for all of it. For you and for the children and for the fence line and for whatever comes after the fence line. I am not a man who changes his mind about things that matter. You may have noticed." She had noticed. "Then ask me properly," she said. He blinked just slightly, that one moment of being caught off guard that she loved because it was rare. Then he reached into the pocket of his coat and produced a ring. It was simple, a thin band of gold with a small garnet setting, nothing extravagant, but she could see it had been chosen deliberately, not grabbed hastily. She would learn later that he had spent 3 months of savings from the work program at the jail to have it made by a jeweler in Cheyenne. "Opal Quinn," he said, "I am a man who has done things wrong and is trying to do things right. And the thing I most want to do right for the rest of my life is take care of you and your children and this place you have built. Will you marry me?" She looked at the ring and at his face and at the stars over the Wyoming horizon and at the house behind them where her children slept safely. "Yes," she said. He put the ring on her finger and she leaned forward and kissed him, there on the back steps in the August dark, and it was the kind of kiss that is also a conversation, that says all the things that letters and restraint and 14 months of distance had kept from being said. It was not rushed. It was not desperate. It was certain. They were married in September of 1884, in a simple ceremony in Clearwater Junction, with Hattie Pierce as witness, and the children in their best clothes, and a justice of the peace named Howell who had a good, strong voice, and seemed genuinely pleased to be doing this particular piece of legal work. Walter stood very straight and shook Phineas's hand after the ceremony with the gravity of a young man completing an important transaction. Rosalie cried a little, not from sadness, but from a general appreciation for significant occasions that she would carry through her whole life. Bess had brought the smallest of her whittled animals, the rabbit, and held it throughout the ceremony, and afterward handed it to Phineas, which was her version of a blessing. They did not take a honeymoon, because the homestead was not the kind of operation you could leave, but Hattie took the children for 2 nights, conspiratorially and cheerfully, and those 2 nights were their own kind of honeymoon, full of the particular intimacy of 2 people who have arrived somewhere they fought hard to get. The years that followed were real years, not idealized, full of hard work and occasional difficulty, and the ongoing negotiation of 2 strong people sharing a life. But they were good years, deeply and steadily good in a way that Opal had stopped believing was possible for her. Phineas went to work on the homestead with the same methodical energy he had brought to her stove on that first impossible night, and the place changed under his attention in ways that were practical and visible. The north parcel was filed and added to their claim in the spring of 1885. Phineas's knowledge of land law, courtesy of Clement the surveyor, was directly useful in navigating the filing process. The barn roof was rebuilt properly. The kitchen garden doubled in size. The herd of cattle grew from 2 heifers to a proper small operation. Walter, at 11, had an almost professional relationship with the new cattle operation, having decided that cattle ranching was his destiny. Phineas taught him everything he knew, which was considerably augmented by what he learned alongside Walter, because Phineas was a man who did not pretend to know things he didn't know, and he and Walter spent a great deal of time that first year figuring things out together, which was perhaps the best kind of teaching there was. Rosalie read everything she could find and announced at 9 that she intended to be a schoolteacher, which Opal found entirely plausible and thoroughly wonderful. Bess maintained her authority over the chickens with an iron hand and expanded her domain to include a small kitchen garden of her own, separate from Opal's, where she grew things she alone selected and maintained. In the spring of 1886, Opal became pregnant. She told Phineas on a morning in April in the kitchen, simply and directly, the way she did most things. He stood very still for a moment and then crossed the room and put his arms around her and held on, and she felt the particular quality of his relief, the relief of a man who had not been entirely sure he was allowed to hope for this. Their son was born in December of 1886 in a proper snowstorm, delivered by the midwife who served the Clearwater Junction area, a competent and businesslike woman named Mrs. Farrow, who had brought most of the children in the county into the world. He was born at 4 in the morning, healthy and insistently loud, with a shock of dark hair like his father's. They named him James. Walter, who was 13 now, heard the baby cry from his room and was in the hallway before anyone came to get him, and he looked at his half-brother with an expression that was almost comically moved for a 13-year-old boy trying to seem unaffected. Rosalie held James with the careful competence of someone who had been waiting for exactly this responsibility. Bess studied him with the same focused attention she brought to her chickens, and announced that he would be good once he stopped being so loud. Phineas held his son in the thin early morning light while Opal slept, finally, and he sat by the window of the bedroom and looked at this small, impossible face, and felt the whole long distance he had traveled, from Missouri and the bank and the despair and Decker, and the deputy's bullet and the barn and the cell in Cheyenne, all of it, and this was where it had come to. This small face and this breathing house, and the woman sleeping in the bed, and the 3 children down the hall. He thought about a night in December of 1882 when he had come through a barn door out of the cold and heard children coughing and seen a cracked pipe fitting, and decided to fix it. He thought about her standing in the kitchen doorway with a candle, not screaming. He pressed his lips to the top of James's head and thought that some decisions, made in the middle of the night without thinking too much about them, turned out to be the most important decisions of a person's life. The town of Clearwater Junction had opinions about all of this, as towns do. There had been a period, around the time of their marriage, when Phineas's past had been an active subject of discussion. Hattie told her about it forthrightly, because Hattie was not the kind of friend who kept that sort of thing from you. There were people who thought a convicted man, even a served-his-time man, was not the right presence for the children of a widow woman. There were people who thought Opal Quinn ought to have found someone with a cleaner record. Opal's response to this, delivered to Hattie for general circulation, was that she would appreciate people directing their opinions about her choices toward the considerable challenges of their own lives, and that she had thought carefully about what was best for herself and her children, and trusted she would not need to revisit the matter. This was delivered with the particular Opal Quinn quality of finality that people in Clearwater Junction had learned, over time, not to argue with. The opinions faded, as opinions do, when faced with the simple evidence of a family getting along. People saw Phineas Hayes helping a neighbor fix a collapsed fence without being asked. They saw him at the church social, where he was quiet but present, and where he paid for things without fanfare. They saw Walter Hayes, as Walter had begun to call himself, riding into town with the confidence of a boy who is being raised well. They saw Rosalie and Bess, and then eventually small James, who was by all accounts a cheerful and robust child who clearly had no opinion about his father's history. By 1888, the Clearwater Junction opinion of Phineas Hayes was that he was a solid man who had made mistakes and put them right, which was in fact the most accurate description available. 1888 was also the year that Emmett Decker was finally caught, in New Mexico territory, after a robbery gone wrong in which he had been identified by 4 separate witnesses. The news came through the territorial papers in the spring. Decker was tried and sentenced to 20 years in the federal penitentiary. Phineas read the news at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning and set down the paper and sat for a long moment. Opal, who was nursing James in the rocking chair by the window and watching him, said, "How do you feel?" Like something has been tied off, he said. A loose end. He looked at her. Like I can stop looking over my shoulder on that particular front. Good, she said. He nodded slowly. He looked out the window at the yard, the repaired fence line, the good barn with its solid roof, the kitchen garden coming up strong. I was so angry at him for so long, he said. And then I left and I was mostly angry at myself. And now I just think he was a man who made terrible choices and dragged other people into them. And now there are consequences, and that is how it should work. Yes, she said, that is how it should work. He looked at James, who had fallen asleep at her breast with the boneless completeness of an infant, and then at her and said, I am very grateful. For Decker being caught, she said mildly. For everything that happened after I left Decker, he said. For a broken pipe fitting in a cold December. For a woman who handed me a rag at midnight instead of screaming. She laughed quietly, not to wake James. I thought about screaming. I know, he said. I appreciate the restraint. She settled James more securely against her shoulder and looked at her husband across the kitchen, in the warm morning, in the house that was so different now from the barely surviving house of that first winter. The stove he had fixed stood against the wall, still solid, still working, still giving off the heat that was the most basic promise a house could make to the people inside it. Do you know what I think about sometimes, she said. Tell me. I think about the night you said that. Your children should not wake to a frozen house. The way you said it, like it was just the obvious thing. Like of course, that was the thing that needed doing. She looked at him steadily. That was the moment, for me, before I knew anything about you. That was the moment I thought this is a good man, whatever else he is. Phineas Hayes looked at his wife in the morning light of their kitchen. In the life they had built out of a broken stove, and a blizzard and 14 months of letters and everything that had come before and after, and he said, it was obvious. Children should be warm. Yes, she said, they should. James stirred and made a small sound and settled back into sleep. Outside, Walter was in the yard with the horses, doing something that involved a bridle and a great deal of concentration. Rosalie was in the small room off the kitchen where Opal had set up a proper writing desk for her, working on something for school. Bess was in the chicken yard. The Wyoming morning was bright and cold in the way of October, with the aspens turned, and the air carrying that particular clean edge that meant winter was coming but had not yet arrived. And there was work to be done, as there was always work to be done. But for this moment, there was just the kitchen and the fire and the stove and the sleeping baby, and the man across the table who had fixed the broken thing and stayed. In the spring of 1890, Opal found out she was pregnant again. This time she told Phineas in the evening, after the children were in bed, on the back steps where they had first really talked, where he had proposed. She handed him a cup of coffee and then said it matter-of-factly and watched him absorb it with that particular stillness, and then the slow spread of something across his face that was simply happiness, straightforward and unguarded. Boy or girl, he said, meaning he was speculating, not asking her to know. We will find out in November, she said. What do you want, he asked. She thought about it. I don't have a preference, she said honestly. I just want another one of ours. He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they sat in the spring evening, with the last light going off the horizon. The child was a girl born in November of 1890, and they named her Louisa after his mother, which was something Phineas had suggested and Opal had agreed to immediately, because it was exactly right. Louisa Hayes arrived with a great deal more commentary than James had, making her opinion of the outside world clearly audible from her first moments, which Bess, now 13 and a highly informed observer of new arrivals, declared meant she would have strong opinions about everything. She was right. Louisa was, from her first capable expressions, a person of intense and loudly expressed views, which was both exhausting and thoroughly entertaining, and which she had clearly inherited from both sides. James, at 3, received her with the baffled goodwill of a small boy who has been told that a baby is coming and is not entirely clear on the implications. He stood beside her basket and looked at her with a focused concern and eventually said, "She's small," which was his most significant assessment. The family grew, and the years turned. By 1892, Walter was 18 and had established himself as a genuine asset to the cattle operation, which had grown considerably into what was now, by the standards of Laramie County, a respectable small ranch. He had his father's, Phineas's, practical intelligence and his mother's stubbornness, a combination that served him very well in the business of keeping cattle alive through Wyoming winters. Rosalie, who was 17, was teaching reading to the younger children in their area informally, gathering them at the Quinn homestead on Wednesday afternoons and running sessions with the focused authority of someone who had found her purpose. There was talk of a proper schoolhouse being built in Clearwater Junction, and Hattie had already put Rosalie's name forward as a candidate for teacher, which Rosalie had accepted with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose plan is proceeding on schedule. Bess, 16, had expanded her agricultural interests beyond chickens to include a small but serious vegetable market garden, selling produce to the general store in Clearwater Junction and to several families in the area. She kept accounts in a neat ledger with the precision of a banker, and Phineas, watching her, told Opal privately that Bess would probably run something substantial by the time she was 30. James was a boisterous, horse-obsessed 5-year-old who had inherited his biological father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes, and who was currently convinced that the proper age to start riding independently was right now, regardless of what anyone else thought about it. Louisa, not yet 2, was conducting a running experiment on how much noise a person could make, while simultaneously getting into things she was not supposed to get into, and was apparently getting excellent results. It was in the summer of 1892 that Phineas finished building the addition onto the house. He had been working on it in sections for 2 years, adding to the original structure methodically and carefully, because they had outgrown the original 4 rooms in ways that were increasingly evident. The addition gave them 2 more proper bedrooms and a larger sitting room and a back porch with a proper roof, and when it was finished, he stood back and looked at it with his hands on his hips in the posture of a man who is satisfied with a thing. Opal came out and stood beside him. The house was larger now, more complicated, more lived in. You could see the original structure within it and the addition around it, the 2 things that were now one thing, which felt to Opal like a reasonable metaphor for a great many other things in her life. She took his hand. He looked at the house and then at her. "It'll need a new coat of whitewash before winter," he said. "It will," she agreed. "I'll get to that in September." "Good." They stood there together in the summer afternoon, in the yard of their house, on the land they had claimed and worked and fought to keep. And behind them, they could hear Bess calling something to Walter in the pasture and James making sound effects for whatever game he was playing in the dirt near the barn, and Louisa banging something in the kitchen. She thought about a woman standing alone in a kitchen in December 1882 with a candle in her hand and a broken stove and 3 coughing children, and she thought about the distance between that night and this afternoon, which was not just time. It was everything that had happened in the time. The decisions and the risks and the letters and the hard days and the good evenings and the children and the house and the land. "I am very happy," she said. He squeezed her hand. "So am I," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. The day was long and still ahead of them, full of the ordinary requirements of feeding and working, and managing the ongoing project of a family on the Wyoming frontier, all of it waiting. But right now, it was just the 2 of them and the house, and the knowledge that it was theirs. All of it, honestly and completely, built from a night when a stranger had fixed a broken stove in the cold and said your children should not wake to a frozen house. From a night when a lonely woman had handed a stranger a rag instead of screaming, because she had recognized, in some wordless way, that he was trying to do the obvious right thing, which was to make sure the children were warm. All the rest of it, the love and the fear and the letters and the ring and the years and the children and the rooms added onto the house, all of it had begun there in the most ordinary and most essential act. Someone was cold. Someone fixed that. Everything followed. In the evening, when the children were all eventually in their beds, the little ones sleeping and the older ones reading by lamplight in their rooms, Opal and Phineas sat in the sitting room of the expanded house, the new part which had good solid walls and a window that looked out toward the north pasture, and there was a fire in the hearth, and they were both tired in the way of people who have spent a full day doing useful things. He was reading. She was mending. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked steadily. She looked across the room at him, the dark hair more touched with gray than it had been at 30, the face she knew now in every light, the hands she had watched work for 10 years at every task that the life required. "Phineas," she said. He looked up. "Thank you," she said, "for fixing the stove." He looked at her for a moment, and something moved through his expression, something warm and deeply knowing, the expression of a man who understands the full weight of what has just been said and what it encompasses. "Thank you," he said, "for handing me the rag." Outside, the Wyoming night was cold and clear and full of stars, and inside the house the fire burned, and the children slept warm, and the clock kept time, and the two people in the sitting room returned to their reading and their mending, and were exactly where they were supposed to be.